Okay, I'm not sure. It says that I'm live now. They changed something. This is terrible. Ugh, what the heck? Okay. So you guys just didn't hear the last 25 minutes of stuff that I talked about? Okay. Oh, wow. Okay, I guess we're going to start all the way over. I just got done literally doing 25 minutes of tuning advice. Awesome. Awesome. Well, let's kick back over, and that's so weird. Yeah, okay. I wish, you know what? It was going really well. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the garage. I just sat here for 25 minutes and talked about tuning stuff and was wondering why nobody was participating. I apologize for the late start. Something's changed on the. Oh, yeah, no, I talked for 25 minutes. Yeah, no, I actually talked for 25 minutes about tuning. I had no clue. I was wondering why, because I was giving my buddy Andrew and Deb a huge shout out for the awesome care package that they sent me from Australia. We loved it. You guys made our day. We've got one that's going to be heading your way here soon. Okay, so we're doing Gen 4 tuning. Let's start. Well, literally, Leroy, you are correct, because now not only do I have to start the stream through my software, I have to click a button on YouTube's webpage, which is just mind-blowing to me why they would set it up that way. So let's just get into it, and I'm going to rehash all this stuff over again. What we're doing, we're talking about GM Gen 4. We're going to look specifically at the E38 because the E40, E67 stuff literally crosses over. All this stuff is just really, there you'll see similarities, and you'll also see similarities from the Gen 3 stuff to the Gen 5 stuff. So I will do my best to answer your questions as they pop up, but I'm just going to kind of get on a roll here and, try and throw your questions down there. I'll try and pay attention. I can't make you any promises because we got a lot of stuff to cover, and I appreciate the almost 30 people that sat around in the chat room while I literally talked to myself. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about tuning, what we're doing in tuning. The big thing to know is that there's a lot of misnomers out there. We talk about tuning a vehicle, we adjust the fueling, things like that. We're never really adjusting the fueling unless you're changing injectors, things like that. So if we look underneath our fuel tab here, we've got all this information. You have to think of these as being like constants. These are constants in an equation where at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is take 14.7 pounds of air and add 1 pound of fuel in order to reach that happy burn ratio. And of course that shifts for power enrichment, things like that. But keep that in mind. What we're actually calculating and tuning for is how this system measures airflow. So if you are, in a great example is we can come over here under the mass airflow frequency table, and let's kind of scroll through here and find my favorite one. 3000 Hertz has 148.8 pounds of air. In order to accomplish 14.7, it's going to need about 10 pounds of fuel for the same amount. And that's per hour. We can look at our units up here and see that we're in pounds per hour. And if we go down to pounds per minute, same ordeal. We can come over to 3000, 2.48. We can calculate that down to the amount of fuel based off of weight that we need to accomplish it. So what we're doing when we tune is we are correcting this calculation from the airflow standpoint. We're using a wideband sensor in the exhaust, and that wideband sensor is telling us the output of what we're putting into the motor via air and fuel, and it's giving us that ratio. So whenever we correct it, we have to correct it by correcting the fuel side of it and say, oh, well, we're running lean. What happens when we're running lean is that we're calculating this much airflow when we actually have this much airflow up here. And so we're only getting fuel for this amount of airflow. We need fuel for this amount of airflow. So 10% lean means we are 10% low on the airflow, and in turn, we're going to be 10% low on the fuel. That's the whole process to the fuel side of tuning. Keep that in mind. So what do? We go in, we set certain things up in order to isolate. Because if you look at the way this is set up, we've got mass airflow and volumetric efficiency. And that's been a consistent on GM platforms for the last, 20 years. And it all ties together underneath dynamic. And I apologize, guys. My mouse has been acting up. So if you see me doing silly stuff, it's me trying to get my cursor to move. So we've got dynamic airflow. Dynamic airflow serves a great purpose. It's worked so good for GM for so long, in which they have taken both the volumetric efficiency, which is a speed density based air to fuel calculation, and mass airflow, and they figured out a way to kind of blend these two together, because the mass airflow really excels whenever you have steady state air, which is in the higher RPMs, whereas volumetric efficiency handles transient fueling real well. So if we're just sitting there idling and all of a sudden we gas it, there's a onrush of air. The volumetric efficiency has a better chance of calculating that onrush of air and providing the correct amount of fueling versus mass airflow, which can cause issues. It gets even more critical whenever we get into mass airflow with things like cams, superchargers, stuff like that, where we have weird air turbulence down in the lower RPMs. Cams really bad about creating reversion, where you can almost, see pulses of air in the intake because of the way the cam breathes, where the flow will actually stop as far as the mass airflow sensor is concerned. And so we've got to end up using both of these. A lot of guys like to tune out there and just do mass airflow only tunes, and whenever they do that, drivability has issues with, transients, idle, things like that. So let's talk about going in and setting this thing up. We're going to dive right in. We're going to go in and say, hey, I want to do mass airflow first. And I generally do mass airflow first because it's easier. It's quicker. We have a nice, chart as opposed to a table. So this table can be hard to tune. This chart, this single row of values that correlate with a hertz that is based off of air temperature and the amount of air that is passing through the mass airflow, a lot easier to tune this. So we'll set this thing up, and what we want to do is we're going to force this thing into high speed. High speed is whenever we are using the mass airflow for the majority of the airflow calculations. It's still going to reference the VE table. There's no such thing as a mass airflow only tune on these platforms. They still reference the VE table in certain situations. Now, we can do a speed density only tune by getting rid of the mass airflow, but we still have the VE playing a role whenever we're in a mass airflow tune. So we come in here, we lower this stuff down. We can do 199 as a starter. And so what we're saying is disable dynamic airflow above 100 RPMs. We go into high speed, that's steady state. We have laminar airflow. We, that's whenever we're going to be into mass airflow only. Now we've got some other stuff that we have to do on top of that. Namely, we have fuel, and fuel has a bunch of these sub tabs underneath here that can affect your fueling without you seeing the results. All of this stuff on this tab right here, all is going to roll up underneath the commanded AFR or commanded EQ, but a lot of these tabs underneath here are not reflected on that. And if we don't have a way to see that fuel adjustment, we can't properly calculate the error ratio. Big ones, things like temperature control, cat over temp. It's enabled on this. We've got to disable that during the tuning process, because what it will do is it'll calculate a catalyst converter temperature, and it will add additional fuel to try and cool that thing off. Well, that additional fuel is not logged as part of our commanded AFR or EQ ratio. And so what can happen is if we tune with this on, we're going to see rich areas, and then we might go back out the next day and we may not meet the requirements of the catalyst over temp. And because of that, it doesn't add that additional fuel, and suddenly we're really lean because we tuned with it on. So we have to disable that. The other big one that we have is DFCO. decel fuel cutoff, what we're doing here is whenever you come off the throttle and you have no load on the motor, there's no reason to have fuel injected at that point in time. And so it just shuts that fuel off. That is not reflected once again in the commandeds. And so it will read very lean on there. And so my rule of thumb is I like to go in here and look at what all of our enables are and go ahead and just max all these things out. So whenever we have an enable ECT, we can come in here and say, okay, at 300, I don't want it to be able to work, but we also need to look at the disabled, so we can do 299, and the disabled says below this set point, this is disabled. Same ordeal on the RPMs. We can take this up to 8,000, so we'll do 799 on the disabled RPM. Anytime we're below 799.9, we are disabled. And then same ordeal, clutch fuel cutoff. If you have a manual, bump this up to 300, 8,000, and 300 on an ECT. So, oh yeah, good point. Where is the DSIT mode on this platform? DSIT is another one. It is, may not be on the late E38s, is it? Other one that we want to look at is displacement on demand. If you have displacement on demand on, disable it. You're safe in just turning it off completely. Trust me, you're not going to pick up any more mile per hour on there. Get rid of it. And now we are in a mode where our airflow dynamically set up is going to always be in high speed. That allows us to go out, focus on this table, and dial this thing in. And we'll talk about mass airflow real quick. I've got a log pulled up, and this is a 2011 6.2 liter Corvette in here. Let's take a look at what it takes to do a graph layout, because this is one of the most important things that people have problems with. And I know a lot of you guys are probably running my setup that I sell on the website for $5, and it'll have most of this information in there, but I want to show you how to, okay, LS is saying this underneath injector, the DSIT mode. Fuel, general, boop. There we go. Enrich DSIT mode. Turn that one off also. So, we're going to set up a graph from scratch just to give you guys an idea of how to set these things up. And the big things that we're looking for is over here, we've got to have data in these parameter lists. This is the lifeblood of information that's coming in. Everything after that point that's being calculated is required to have the proper data in this section. Come on, mouse. So we're looking at mass airflow right now. So we need to go over to our airflow tab, look at our mass airflow calculation table, and we need to take into account everything that we have in here. The big one being right here, Hertz. We're looking at mass airflow frequency. We're going to be basing that table off of Hertz. So whenever we come over to here, we need to make sure that we have our Hertz parameter. What I see a lot of times whenever people have issue with mass airflow is they'll bring in the first mass airflow that they see, and it's the actual pounds per hour. I'm not sure if there's even it's on this log. Doesn't look like it. And they're not bring. Oh, there it is. They'll bring in this one thinking that they have the right parameter in. This is the result of the mass airflow calculation. This is the raw data from the sensor right here. This is what we have to calibrate, is this Hertz. So make sure that that's in there. So we'll come in here. Let's do our graph layout. Let's add a new graph. So main parameter, that's going to be what the table's built off. In this case, it's Hertz. We can come up here, click this box. It's going to filter out anything that we do not have in our list already. And then we have this nice text filter in here. So we can go mass. We type that in. We've got our mass airflow sensor. We're looking for frequency. Once again, not mass flow rate, but frequency. We'll add that in. If it pops this up, 99% of the times, you're fine. Just say, yeah, sounds good. Use the generic. So we've got our Hertz in there. Now the next thing that we need, oh, I'm sorry. I got off on a tangent. This is actually our air-fuel ratio. We need to do our mass airflow Hertz down here. Walk that back. So we've got our mass airflow Hertz down here in our columns to match our columns. This is the output. This is the math output that we're looking at. Cool thing about this is if we were to come over here and look at our intake parameters, we've got a wideband that is showing in lambda. And so we're going to use equivalence ratio commanded. Here on the main parameter, we're going to come down into math, and we'll look underneath lambda AFR. We can use the default math. Now, there's certain times that you can't use this default math. We're using lambda, so we're going to use EQ ratio error. Now you see how both of these have a lambda symbol beside them? If they do not have that symbol, they will not work with the default math. The default math is very reliant on the parameter units. Same AFR is not, because there's not a unit for AFR, but if you're bringing in your wideband and you do not have it scaled for lambda, if it is not set up to transform to lambda, it will not work with the default math. Now we can go later on and talk about different maths and how to set this stuff up manually, because the cool thing is we have access to these things. But we bring in our EQ ratio error math. We've got our mass airflow sensor down here in hertz on columns. Now we need to populate this, and so we're going to use our curve. This is on your tune. You're going to come in here, come up to the corner, go into the column axis, and we're going to copy these labels. So all these up here, 0, 1, 50, 300, we'll copy those over, paste those in. And so now we have a table that we're building out here, and we're going to call this thing MAF EQ error. We've got a couple other things that we want to do in here. Decimal points, we can leave this at 1. Cell hits. This is a filtering function that says, hey, I need to populate data in each cell. All these boxes up here are cells. I need to populate data this many times in that cell, and then it will average it to put a number in there. You want to have some filtering on that, because a lot of transient stuff like that can cause issues and skew these numbers out. If we come in here, put this out to about 10, that means we have at least 10 points of data in here before we consider this a valid point that we're going to average out and give us an error ratio. And then we have our shading, so we can add some color in there. You know, we're in percentages. This is a percent. We can see by our units here, so we can add a 10 and a negative 10. And we can throw some color on there. So if we're 10, we're lean, so we'll throw it red. We're negative 10, we're rich. Saying we're 10%, we need to pull 10% fuel out, so we'll make that green. And now we have our new graph in here, which matches our old graph. But as I talked about the filtering, we've got some boxes up here that we can look at this data. Come on, mouse. If we look at this data, we can look at our highest value. Look at this. This is our highest values. This is literally the highest value we hit was 100% rich, or lean in this cell. We can look at our lowest values. That was 14% rich. This is our average. So if we click on this one, this is how many times we populated data in that cell. Look at this cell has 32,579 hits on that cell. So the number that we look at average on there is looking at 32,000 values and taking the average of 32,000 counts of data. More counts equals more accuracy. So if we come over here towards the end, this cell right here has 5. That cell should not have any data in it. It doesn't. 5700 has 88 points, 36, thoroughly 36 at 5250. So if we look at the average, that cell is not an accurate representation. Look at the cells around it. Look at the counts on those cells. We've got 284 counts here. We go up to 90 counts there. If we look at the averages between those two, this cell here and this cell here is more likely to be accurate than the cells in between it, because there's not as many counts on those. And this is kind of one of those pro tips. As you get more into tuning, you can come through here and look at a table like this. You can look at the results and say, oh man, I've got some wonky readings on here. Let me see how many counts I have in there. Well, if I've got a count of 32,000, 15,000, even 3,000, these are pretty accurate, even down to here. Now we get into some counts where in between these two, we've got 810. I'm going to trust these a lot more than I'm going to trust the 810 to be accurate. So where we might have 7.5% lean there, but everywhere around it we have 2.5 to 4% lean, we're probably actually going to be 2.5 to 4% lean in that area. So keep that in mind. That's something that you don't see a lot of people doing. That'll help you out whenever it comes into it. So now we've got mass airflow set up. We've been tuning our mass airflow, going through, doing our copy, using our paste special by half that everybody's familiar with if you've seen any of my videos. looking at our data, making sure our data lines up. The cool thing about this thing is what we want to do is create a curve that it should be linear like this, or not linear, but it should follow a shape. Shouldn't have, you know, data out there that's doing this kind of stuff. If you got that, you've got bad data in there. Keep that in mind. Now, doesn't mean that we might not have little peaks like this, or maybe a little value like this every once in a while. That can happen, but keep an eye on those spots. It's not very often that you're going to see peaks, valleys outside of that. You might actually find some dynamic issues on your vehicle where, as we come in here and say we grab this area and we'll bring this up 3% to give you an idea, we might have something like that that happens where we're really flowing a lot of air and then it kind of tips off down in this. That's not out of the ordinary. You might be hitting a flow restriction, things like that, where it actually tails off. But the idea is we just don't want a lot of peaks in there. If we have to, we can come in here, use our smooth, kind of smooth it out. That will work a lot better than something like that, or even something like this. Rough transitions like this on a mass airflow curve, it's not going to like it. You're going to have very bad data on this scanner whenever you're said and done. So we're looking for something more along that lines. Even one more time, if we can, smooth it out. That to be expected. The dynamics of the motor, the way the motor works, the mods that we add, intake manifolds, cold air intakes, heads, you know, long tube headers, all this stuff will change the dynamics of the way that the engine breathes. You're going to see some shifts in there, so we'll tune around those. We look for that false data. We smooth that false data out, and if we come back, let's go back quite a few steps here. We've just applied this change based off our error graph, and we always want to go through and kind of scan through and make sure this data is sane, makes sense, because as I said, if we have a spike at 2850 or something like that, 4950, we got a spike like that, we know that that's wrong. We can use our tools to interpolate across that and get rid of that spike because we know it's not going to be there. And then on top of it, we want to look at our transitions out of the changes that we made. We'll come down to the bottom side. I hate this. Let me turn this off. Come down to the bottom side real quick. Look at our first data point versus our last data point where we didn't make a change, and we're looking for consistency across that. And whenever we don't have that, we can actually grab that last data point, use something like the interpolate feature to go beyond where we captured data. Same ordeal. If we look at this 773 to 829 to 896, that's pretty even, that's pretty good, but when in doubt, we can always go ahead and expand beyond that, interpolate out. Got to take a drink of my beer real quick. Okay, so mass airflow. Done. We've gone through, we've tuned our mass airflow. We've watched the other mass airflow videos that we go more in depth, things like that. We've made incremental changes. Our mass airflow curve has fallen in line. We've gone from, 7% lean, 4% lean. Now this whole thing is looking more like this section right here. You know, we've got a nice, maybe slightly 1-2% rich curve across the entire mass airflow curve. Now we need to go in and do volumetric efficiency. One thing to keep in mind, as we talked about earlier, is we have a mass airflow sensor and it's not as effective down low. We can come in here, look at our VE table. Say 1600 RPM and below, our mass airflow sensor is having issues because we got a very aggressive cam. Now once we get up to 1800, mass airflow takes off. We've got a beautiful curve that we've developed out. The errors are dialed in just perfectly, things like that. All this ties back to our dynamic set points here on our airflow. We can use this to make an informed decision on how we want to set our cutover. So whenever we do dynamic airflow tuning, we set this high, but whenever we're all said and done, we may want to set this at 2500. It's at 4000 stock, but we don't have to leave this at 4000 RPMs. We can lower this down and say at 2500 RPMs, our mass airflow sensor has no issues. Our fuel curve looks great. Our air readings are just spot on. I'm going to lower this thing down at 2500 RPMs whenever everything's said and done. In the meantime, while I'm tuning volumetric efficiency though, I know I've got a cutoff around here. So between these two cells right here, We are in volumetric efficiency primarily below there, and we're in mass airflow primarily above that. So while I go through and tune this, I'm going to find that cutoff. I'm going to try and lower that thing down as much as possible. If I can get that down to 2,000, even 1,500 RPMs, where the mass airflow sensor has shown reliability above 1,500 RPMs, when the dynamic airflow calculation comes into play, I'm going to try and lower this thing down to 1,500 RPMs. Now, this is the correct way of doing a mass airflow only tune. Technically, it's not mass airflow only, but we're using the mass airflow primarily above 1,500 RPMs, and then we're relying on our volumetric efficiency below that set point, specifically where we have problems with the mass airflow is around idle, things like that. The cool thing about it is going into that mindset, whenever we come in here and we switch over to dynamic airflow, we're going to max all this stuff out. We can bring this up to whatever the limit is, probably 8,000. And then we'll do 799 on this to say that we are always going to be out of high speed. We're always going to be on that speed density table. We're going to also go into our engine diagnostics, and we're going to set our mass airflow high and low fail. Down low, big thing here, big catch-all. On your DTCs, you need to come in here on the P0103 and set this thing to mil on first air. Now, technically, you don't have to, but the first time that you go out and pull a log, if this check engine light is not set, this 103, it will still be using the mass airflow sensor. We don't want that. So now that we are set up, we're using our volumetric efficiency table. We have our VE table, graphed out over here. In this case, these are all Gen 3s. Let's set one up real quick. Let's do graph layout. We're going to add a graph. We're using EQ still, so we'll go ahead and go down to our parameters, find our lambda AFR, EQ ratio error like we did earlier. We're going to set up all of our filters. Add our colors in. Come on, mouse, work with me. There we go. Just like we did the mass airflow table, we'll set this stuff up. And then now we've got to do the column and row axis. We're going to base those off of our volumetric efficiency table. So if we come over here, open our VVE table in, obviously our first one's going to be RPMs. We can copy our engine speed over. We'll add our parameter in here. Once again, we can click our filter. We're looking for RPM. Boom, boom, and boom. Now our next one, based on your platform, manifold air pressure. We'll copy our row axis. And filter once again, type in, nice thing about this, we can actually type in map and it'll bring up our manifold air pressure. We'll paste this in. And then always I like to do, let's do 4th gen VE 1 bar. And now we've got our 1 bar table here that's going to line up. This is very wonky. What is happening here? Oh, it's in PSI. What did I miss here? Using the wrong parameter. If you're getting bad data like that, there we go. Is that going to fix this? There, okay. I grabbed the wrong parameter. If you get wonky data like that, check your inputs, check your parameters. That's generally what happens. What you'll see is a couple other things in this situation. If you have a table like this, let's do a different one. Okay, have a table like this where you have your parameters load out. Say we've got RPM, manifold air pressure. You can see we've got a box there, but no data is populating in that box. That is an indication you're missing a parameter over in your channel list here. So if we were to go in here and look at our G3 AFR VE, we're using AFR math. Another cool trick that you can do is come up here to your math parameters. We'll come down to our AFR error, and we're going to have a pink cell here. So these pink cells right here on our math parameters means that it is not in the channel list. Whereas if we look at our EQ ratio error, see these are not pink. That is because they are in that list. So work the data back. Work back from your graph and figure out what you're having an issue with. You'll also see sometimes where it may just go across one row and you have a bunch of data in this, or just a bunch of data in one column, and that is going to be an indication that you don't have one of these two parameters that are building your graph out. So, little sidebar there. But now here, we've got some error data in here based on our volumetric efficiency table. And we can talk about, doing the copy and paste stuff all day long, where we can come in here, copy, paste, special. We like to do half steps. Don't do that. Because specifically on volumetric efficiency, half steps are going to help to keep a lot of this intact, because what happens is, no, we don't want to do this. All of this table is built off these coefficients right here. And this is second order polynomial math. And we'll talk about that. We'll look at the graphs and the tables and how that plays into it. But you have all of these things, the constants, the coefficients, all of these numbers that make absolutely no sense. Very, very smart guy. Most of you have heard of him, Blue Cat, who did the transmission tuning software, was one of the first guys to take that data and create a way of generating a standard table like we're used to tuning on, And so HPTuners ended up folding it into the software so we could actually have a way of editing this table that makes sense. But what happens is we have to calculate things. In fact, we've got the virtual VE to coefficients. We take this data and it calculates it back over. And so there are restraints on the way that this data is calculated. So if you look at this in a table format, like our graph format like this, you can see that there's certain shapes. And being that it is second polynomial math, there's only certain shapes that this math can take form of without it breaking. And so we have curves and we have dips, but you can only go from this side to this side. You can only go a certain direction, while at the same time, the opposite direction of a zone, which all this is broken down into zones here. Each zone can only have a certain shape, a dome or a dip in it. And because of that, whenever we make changes, and this is a prime example, let's go to this corner of this zone. Let's add 10% here. We'll multiply this up. We've shifted this up to a 1481. This whole zone is going to have to change. But watch what happens to the opposite side of this. We raise this up, and the opposite side had to raise up also to maintain that shape. And so we had a dip in the middle of it, and that dip will have to go down most of the time in order to bring the edges up. And that's why zones are just so crazy to work with, and why we have issues with it, because we might have a specific area. If we look at our next zone here, zone 1, we'll go ahead and highlight it. We might look at a specific area where we say, oh man, all of this zone is really good except for this spot right here. It is for some reason reading 10% rich, and I'm trying to take 5% of fuel out of this. Whenever I do that, I can't take 5% out of this without taking, basically the same amount on the other side to maintain the curve. Now, what we can also do that is cool about zones is if we grab an entire zone here, 6, and if we move this zone up 10%, it shifts up. You saw all the numbers change. Whenever you calculate this, all the numbers will stay the same because we moved the zone on a constant. The zone itself is a constant. The size of the zone is a constant. We've effectively changed a constant just for this zone right here. So keep that in mind. Volumetric efficiency, VVE, all this stuff, huge pain. But be aware where your zones are at. Play to the zone strengths and realize, hey, if I have a specific side of this zone that I'm going lean in, I'm going to have issues trying to enrich in this zone without doing the same thing, without breaking the curve, the shape, the dome, the bowl of the zone. So, kind of got off track there, but now we've got our graph set up here. We're going to look at it. We've got some spots down here. This stuff down here, going to be troublesome. What I would suggest if you're getting into stuff like this, this is probably an indication that DFCO was still on during this tune. What you can do is then go in and look for specific zones and copy that data over zone by zone. So say that we're wanting to address the 1200, 1400 even lean spot that we're seeing. Where's my mouse at? From this point down, we can come in here, copy this data over, keep in mind where your first cell is in the corner. We're at 437.5. We can copy this over, come over, find that same area, 37.5, 400. We can do our paste special, multiply by half, and just, affect those zones. We were in the zone menu. Don't do that. Let me close this out, make sure I don't ruin anything. You don't want to apply that to this screen. You want to apply it to your actual. So 437.5, come in here, paste special, multiply by half. We've changed these zones. Now, we have some benefits. Durham Horse, the third gen, no, HPTuners does not have auto-tune. The third, the big thing here is you can see that these are red. These blocks are red, which means we've shifted these blocks up. They go this kind of purplish blue if we've shifted the blocks down. So the good news is we brought these blocks up. We can look at some of the data that we did not fill in. Look at both sides of the data. 1634 to 1659. If we were to look at 1643, that falls in line between it that way. Same ordeal. If we do it this way, make sure that it falls in line, because if it does not fall in line, you're going to have issues. Now, an example perfect right here is we've got an 1885 and a 1915 below it. Now, the 1869 is below both of these. That's going to cause an issue whenever we calculate that, and it's going to skew data on both sides of that. So this is an example of where we're going to want to interpolate in between to bring that value up to get it to fall in line. Same ordeal down here. This will just make the calculations work a little bit better whenever we go in and calculate those out. So look for those gaps, fill those gaps in. That way you're not having issues. 1822, that's not going to be much of an issue, but here we've got to go out a little bit further to bring that data up, and then we'll cross-reference this data to make sure that it stays sane. We've got something here that's a little bit interesting going on where we've got 1765, 1742 and a high point there. We might want to bring that down, but pay attention to what that does there, because it can still cause issues. We want to keep that bowl or that dome shape in order to make sure that whenever we hit this button over here, that it doesn't skew this off too much. So let's take an example. We'll come in here. Let's grab this data from 1600 and 37.5, and let's apply it 1600 37.5, and we're just going to paste this as a whole. Man, my mouse is really giving me fits tonight. Come on, mouse, work with me. Typical garage stuff. So we'll paste this. We're going to do a multiply by percentage here. And let's look at the graph. Here's what we just pasted in there. Look at how ugly that is. We got peaks there. We got a really random peak there. We got a lot of weird peaks and valleys in there. We'll calculate this out and see what the math did to try and sort this out. So we had data down in this area that got pulled down or pulled up, and then this data that was up high got pulled down. And so the changes that we may have shifted something initially 10%. It only turns out to be a 4% change by the time the calculations work its way out. We have to work through this. The idea behind it is, as we do volumetric efficiency tuning, specifically virtual volumetric efficiency tuning, we're hoping to get these curves in line to find an area where everything is matching up to what it needs to do. Flatten these curves out and get closer, minimize our error, each step along the way. So each iterative step, we may make 2 steps forward, then 1 step back on the next one, because we might have an issue down on this side of it whenever we get this area sorted out. What we need to do is just try and get that as flat on our error as possible. So if we were to look at this table, like we've got a very decent area in here where we've got problems in this area where we've got peaks that are showing us issues with our zones. What we can do though is we can look at our data as we populate this data and say, oh, we're looking good right here, but we're having issues right here. If this is in the same zone, we can shift our zone boundaries to isolate this into a different zone. If this is one zone here and we're having an issue getting this down while the rest of this is spot on, because if you've got 13.1 here and 0.8 there, we're perfect at 0.8. We're super rich at 13.1, but we've got 2.3 there. So if we had a zone boundary here between 2000 and 2200, maybe we need to move the zone boundary from 22 to 2400. And so then we'll have this area over here that we're working with. And then maybe now we've got a zone over on this side where we can actually shift this number down and bring this number up. As we move one down, bring the other side of the graph up and fix that. And so in order to do that, we'll come in here, look at our zone numbers, see where they're at, find where we have these hard breaks in between zones and say, okay, you know what? I'm having an issue with zone 20 on this side. I want to move zone 20 over into zone 14. And so we got to see that we've got a break at 24 to 26 is probably at 2,500 RPMs. We can come into RPMs and it's at 25. Maybe I need to bring this down to 2,400. And then whenever I do that, now if I come into my volumetric efficiency table, now my zone has shifted and now 20's wider to the left. Now if I needed to move it the other way, I could bring it up to 2,600. And now my zone's over here at 2,600 and my break is at 25. So I like to set my zones up on hard breaks that I can see. So if I've got a 2,400 there, I don't necessarily want a 2,400 or 2,600. Same thing, 1,750. I might put this, if I know they're at every 200, I might go 1,800 on that one. And then on our zone 3-4, I might go 3,200. So I can see the zone breaks on the table. Now, whenever I do this, I know that I've got a zone right there. I've got one right there. I've got one right there. I've got clear demarcation lines in between the two. Obviously, this one's too narrow. I would bring that out a little bit. But you see what I'm talking about, where I don't want a zone break at 1,500 RPMs and 2,500 RPMs because the way my table's laid out, I can't see that line. There's data from this point to this point that is being interpolated that we can't actually see because it's in between what we can see. Same ordeal, manifold air pressure. We're going every 0.5. That one's not as critical because if we come in here, most of these are going to be whole numbers and we have our table broken up by 0.5 so we can see all these whole numbers. We can see 21. You know, we can see 40. So I can go to, well, I guess we can't. In this case, we're 2.5, not 0.5. So we would want to set that up. If we're at a 21, we go to a 22.5 for that zone. 22.5. Yep. No. Come on. Why is my decimal not working? Point. You know what? Do it that way. 22.5. Oh, you know what? Got to add a decimal point. Boom. There we go. This adds and subtracts decimal points. So now we got 22.5 that was showing up about 23. So now we got 22.5 on that. Whenever we come back into our volumetric efficiency table, now I know that I've got a zone break directly on 22.5 right there. I can see nice and clean, things like that. That really helps out. Stephen, yes, good question. Do you find that big cams need the zones in the idle areas to be adjusted to make it easier for tuning? Oftentimes, anytime you do any kind of mods, intakes, long tube headers, stuff like that, you're changing the zone dynamics that were from the factory in here. And so this may have worked perfectly fine on a factory setup. As soon as you start doing mods like that, you need to separate these zones out and keep in mind that bowl dome shape whenever you're doing it. Yeah, we did touch 100. That's awesome. We're going to wrap up here. I know we didn't get into as much as I'd want to, but we did have 100 viewers in here, which means we'll do this again for sure. And we'll do another session on Gen 4 here soon where we talk about Spark and stuff like that. Get into some of the other stuff. Let's take a couple minutes here in case you guys have any questions. Yes, into LS tuning, I agree 100%. He says, best change I've ever done was adjust the VVE boundary so the whole table was almost even spread. And I like to do the same thing. I like to, whenever I come in here and see a volumetric efficiency table based on what you're doing, 1, 2, 3 bar, stuff like that, this stuff right here where you've got a zone that's this shaped and a zone that's this shaped, and then this, I don't like that. I like clear demarcation lines on my zones. And so what you'll find, what I like to do on zone map boundaries is flatline these things out. So if we were running a 2-bar, or a 1-bar in this case, I might come in here and do something along these lines and break these up where they're all going to be the same height. That way, whenever you come into the volumetric efficiency, this is, your first set of zones. This is your second set of zones. This is your third set of zones. All these are the same height, and then they're all the same width. That seems to work better for me. Awesome, Steven. I'm glad you enjoyed it. How do I set up tune to use return fuel system with AEM regulator? With boost vacuum reference. The big stuff on that whenever you get into regulators is your flow versus pressure. This is going to be linear because your delta, we're looking at delta, which is the pressure on both sides of the injector. Your fuel pressure versus your manifold pressure. If you have a pressure reference regulator, as your manifold pressure goes up, your fuel pressure automatically goes up. So this flatlines. So this would just be the flow rate of your injectors. So you have 60-pound injectors, boom. Flatline at 60, you're good to go. No raffle on this one. Let's do table building for Hemi next for channels. Okay, Leo, we'll be doing some Hemi stuff really soon. Suggestions for hanging idle depending on the generation. Look underneath your idle airflow and look at your throttle follower stuff. Good crowd. Appreciate everybody taking the time and joining us. And if you're watching this video after the fact, if there's specific things that you guys want to talk about, hit them up in the comments for this video. And I'll be taking suggestions on what you guys want to do for the next stuff. How about enabling PE at 200 RPMs and command desired fuel throughout the RPM? I mean, you could. I don't know if there'd necessarily be a reason to do that. Touch on tip-in fueling. Okay, so tip-in fueling is going to be underneath your transients tab. And so the big stuff that you're going to be looking at on tip-in, this right here, this fuel delta minimum increase is a very big one. Whereas if you're going lean on tip-in fueling, I like to normally bring this up. Bring it up small increments at a time. Don't get too crazy. This is going to touch on some of your fuel wall impact. And then the other one is going to be your impact factor. Same ordeal. This impact factor is a calculation of how much fuel should be on the wall of the port. And that fuel that's on the wall of the port is going to be what allows, whenever you get an onrush of air, it sucks that fuel off the wall of your intake ports. You can bring this stuff up if you're lean during tip-in. Do it 10% at a time and see what the results are. Don't just go hog wild and come in here and double it or anything. Work it up, see if it fixes it. It's only a tip-in issue within the first 1 or 2 seconds of tipping in. If you're still lean after that point in time, you've got enough air that you're no longer dealing with the tip-in issue. You're dealing with a fuel table calculation issue. Sid, I do not have a shop. I am in Pittsburgh. I don't do anything in-person stuff. I do some online tuning, things like that, but Andrew, thank you, brother, for staying up. Andrew is 3:30 on his side of the world, 4:30 at this point in time. I appreciate you sticking with it. And once again, dude, check out this dope Holden hat that Andrew sent my way. Oh, yeah. So, Andrew, tell Deb that we're going to jump on and do a FaceTime with you guys here soon. So, we'll pick a time and place and just catch up. So, but we're going to wrap up. I'm glad everybody that showed up. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope, let me know if you guys want to do future tuning sessions, live tuning sessions, stuff like this, where we go over some stuff. If you find this information beneficial, I will be glad to do more of it. And thanks for taking time out of your guys' weekend and your Saturday to hang out here at the garage. So you guys know the drill. ABT, always be tuning.